All right, YouTube, do you remember Jade Helm, that all encompassing attempted hostile police state takeover to infiltrate the population and enslave them all to the New World Order? At least if you listened to people like Alex Jones or David Icke or somebody like that. Yeah, they were obviously wrong, which I correctly predicted. Well, kudos to me. But I also, I believe, correctly predicted the real reason that it was happening based on simply the map that was released showing the operations of Jade Helm. It's a training exercise for a large regional conflict within the Middle East that will necessitate U.S. involvement. And we're seeing the seeds of it being sown right now in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere now. Now, I want to draw your attention to something that I don't think people have quite comprehended. The fact that Syria and Iraq are utterly and completely fucked and open warfare, total warfare on multiple fronts is occurring there drew Saudi Arabia's attention to their northern border and allowed the Yemeni, the Houthi rebels, the Shiites in Yemen, to revolt and attempt to overthrow the government there. Fighting is still, of course, ongoing. That would not have happened if Syria and Iraq had been stable. The Saudis would have gone in and curb stomped them. Turkey. Turkey just today experienced one of its worst terrorist attacks in history. Over 85 people have been killed, several hundred, I believe, wounded in suicide bombings in their capital of Ankara, which generally, due to its location and its ethnic composition, is considered safe compared to the sort of Kurdish regions of the country. The fact that they would conduct this, whoever was responsible, and we're not sure yet, in Ankara, in the capital city, as opposed to one of these cities in the outlying regions that do experience constant violence, I think probably is going to shock a lot of people there. It was at a peace rally, apparently being conducted by Kurdish minorities who want the fighting to stop, which leads me to believe that Kurdish separatists who do not want the fighting to stop are probably responsible for the attacks. Again, they won't take credit for it because they don't want to give Erdogan's government a reason to, purge more of them. But let's face it, that's the most likely. Could have been ISIS, could have been a Shiite militia, could have been nationalists, could have been Erdogan, attempting to give himself a reason to get more heavily involved in the Kurdish regions, for all we know. So we're not sure exactly who's responsible. That this sort of violence was at a minimum a while ago. There was dialogue going on and sort of agreements being made between the sort of semi-autonomous Kurdish separatists and the Turkish government. That has fallen away completely and been completely undone in the last few months. They've all been ripped up. Basically, you've got hostility within Turkey. You've got hostility in Egypt. And most of these peripheral fights that are going on would not have been possible without the destabilization of Syria and Iraq. You've got to realize how many borders touch these nations. Turkey, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, a small piece of Israel, the Golan Heights, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all of these different nations. And of course, because of that, the Iranians are a partner of the Russians and Chinese, so naturally they got involved. Turkey's in NATO. Egypt is a Western ally, so naturally we got involved. The Jordanians enjoy a good working relationship with the British, so the British got involved. The French are involved as well. The violence has spread into Libya, although there was already violence there, but more violence now, I think, even than like the Benghazi period. Now you've got to realize, Jade Helm, the training exercise, was quite literally that. There was no conspiracy. There was a cover-up, but there was no conspiracy. They didn't want to say what Jade Helm referred to. But I told people from the beginning it refers to the escalation of violence in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and everywhere else, that will eventually necessitate U.S. involvement on the ground in the region. Or I should say, the politicians here, the military here will feel that it necessitates that. I don't think so. Russia's getting itself bogged down. They're going to end up with problems unless they pump more troops into the region. It will be very expensive at a time when they're already in recession. The Chinese are getting involved while their own economy is on the ropes. It's very dangerous for them to get involved. The same with the United States. If we get involved and our economy flatlines while we're involved in the Middle East, it'll be a bloodbath because we'll no longer be able to guarantee our own economic safety while throwing so much money at a foreign conflagration, which is exactly what it will devolve into. ISIS and all of these other groups, all of the militias in the region, totaled together, they probably number in the millions. We're not talking about a few tens of thousands of ISIS members in a vacuum and they're the only ones that are non-state actors. Hezbollah's there, Al-Nusra's there, Al-Qaeda's there, the FSA is a terrorist organization, Kurdish separatists and nationalists are involved within the region. These number at least in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And then you've got all of these other militaries involved as well. I've had people comment on my videos, specifically where I say it's a bad idea to get involved in this, and say, oh, well, you fucking coward, traitor, unpatriotic swine, we need to defend our allies. If you're anti-war, there's something wrong with you. We've already been through this before. We got involved in Iraq and fucked it up in the first place, and thousands of US soldiers died. The fact that many people now don't remember the glorious, shining Western democratic days of watching the news every night and hearing how many US soldiers got sent back in caskets means absolutely nothing to me. Because I do remember it. I did have the cerebral capability to understand at the time what was going on, and it was butcherous and bloody, and we accomplished nothing. Do I expect that Putin's expenditures in Syria are actually going to end the conflict there? Absolutely not. Yeah, he can destroy the FSA. He's still got ISIS to deal with, and that's what he's doing. He's primarily targeting the FSA, just as we primarily target Assad's forces. Nobody's beating on ISIS other than the fucking Jordanians. They can't do it alone. When the region inevitably implodes, either because one of these large nuclear states gets into it with one of the regional states on the other side, shielded by a nuclear power. You'd think the Russians accidentally fuck something up in Turkey, and the Turks ask us for help under the umbrella of NATO, or we fuck something up in Iraq and they ask the Russians for help, or Iran and the Chinese get involved or something. When things inevitably implode, the combined military capabilities, especially considering the economic impacts on the world that would happen if the whole region falls apart, of the United States, Russia, and China fucking combined might not be able to contain the scenario. All of us combined, because of the fog of war and the fact that militants and nationalists and anarchists and communists and every other fucking godforsaken group in the whole region will take up arms at the same time, we might not be able to contain anything. We might end up, the United States might end up involved in Turkey just to maintain the status quo in one state that was formerly allied with us. The Russians will be defending the Iranians, just desperately trying to keep things from unraveling. And they'll have the Chinese in Iraq and Syria or something like that. All of these other countries will just implode. They'll be fighting on every front. Do you realize what confusion will exist in the Middle East if that happens? Now, this could lead to some interesting possibilities. You could see a very strange scenario in which there's so much bloodshed and unrest going on that the United States and Russia and China end up on the same fucking side just trying to restore order. Now, wouldn't that be a sight to behold? Or a situation where all of these Islamists do declare some sort of caliph and end up fighting all three, even though they're all trying to maintain different administrations in these states. Or these states might end up at war. What happens if the Turks declare war on Assad? What happens if the Egyptians say enough is enough and start marching into the region, or the Saudis start going into Iraq? What the fuck do you think's going to happen? This area is partitioned into little pieces, none of which are based upon the ethno-state model. They're all different tribes that are loosely affiliated under some secular umbrella or theocratic umbrella. Mostly they hate one another. You look at Iraq with its Shia majority oppressing the Sunnis, or formerly the Ba'athist party that oppressed everyone, or the Sunnis were in charge and oppressed the majority that was Shia. These states are going to rip themselves apart with conflict. That's exactly what Jade Helm was designed to train our troops for, which is the fact that we're going to be involved in a scenario in which it's not one state or two states that have unraveled and we're on the ground in them, but a dozen states, including states. Turkey is host to U.S. nuclear missile batteries. The Egyptians control the Sinai Peninsula, and thus the Suez Canal, a major trader, the Bosphorus. These two of the world's foremost trading routes. The Bosphorus and the Suez Canal are in the region. Much of the world's fuel supply is in the region. Jerusalem, one of the most important cities as far as religion goes, to three totally different religions, is an important place in the region. You've got Mecca, of course, important to the Islamists, and Tel Aviv, Damascus with all of its various archaeological remains. All of these, even the archaeological remains themselves scattered across the region, are incalculably valuable. So you've got a situation where there's a whole lot of goods in one relatively small area. It's the bridge between Europe and Asia and Africa. It's been fought over for thousands of years. It's no surprise that it's once again seeing fresh fighting. But some of these states probably won't even exist in another decade. If that scenario does unfold, if what I think Jade Helm was for, which is a complete regional cataclysm involving every state in the region fighting every other state, and militants by the millions rising up alongside political groups and activists and everything else, with 3 or 4 nuclear powers involved at the same time. If it gets as bad as I think the US government is planning for it to get, and the Russian government and Chinese governments are planning for it to get, and the Turks and the Egyptians and the Saudis and Iranians certainly are perhaps preparing for, if it gets that bad, then Jade Helm begins to make a hell of a lot of sense. You would want a few thousand extra troops that have trained under similar conditions and sort of gone through the motions as though they were taking part in such an exercise, to be analyzed to see exactly what we should and should not do to minimize our casualties in the region. I supported Jade Helm. I had no problem with it because I realized the number of troops participating. Really, what they were doing is conducting a study of whether they could move into such an area, probably in small numbers, to conduct assassinations, sort of topical resistance against Islamists and so forth, to see if they could creep into an area unnoticed more easily to help restore order. I think alongside a much larger troop incursion by the United States and NATO forces in the region, which would become necessary if the whole area unravels. You've got to realize we've got people in there that we're treaty bound to protect if they're attacked. And right now they're surrounded by terrorists. They're surrounded by hostile states. The Russians would defend the Iranians in the same token, the Chinese as well. Pakistan is already part of the Saudi coalition. They're a nuclear state, and not exactly what one would consider a stable state with a lot of common sense, but rather one that has continuously had problems with its own terrorist problems, its own militants of various colors. So yeah, that's what Jade Helm's for. It's a training exercise for if the Middle East situation gets worse. It's already getting worse. Worst terrorist attack in recent history in Turkey, a NATO ally, just today, paired with unconfirmed reports that the Turks fired on and brought down at least one Russian jet. Now, I'm going to say that that's probably bunk because I haven't seen a reliable source for it. You're really seeing it more on like Before It's News or the UK's Express or Daily Mail or something. I'm not sure that I trust that to be true. I think that this is a fear-mongering, unconfirmed report that will never be confirmed. But if true, I mean, it would be horrendous, and they've already had air incursions anyway. The Russians supposedly accidentally hit Iran with failed missiles. Maybe, maybe not. We're never going to know. There's no possible way to know what's going on for the average person. It's almost pointless to have an opinion beyond something informed by something like the Jade Helm map, or you happen to live in the region or something and you are sort of on the up and up, because the fog of war is going to really totally obscure everything. And even worse than that, media spin on both sides. You think you're going to get a fair story from RT about what Russia's doing in Syria? You think they're going to tell you the truth? Or you think the New York Times is going to tell you the truth about what anyone's doing? Or the Chinese media? You're not going to get a straight story from anyone. Al Jazeera, yeah, I think I'll trust them for the best news about why the United States is responsible for everything wrong in the region. And then I'm going to listen to Bloomberg and hear why Russia is ultimately at fault for everything wrong in the world. You're not going to get a straight story. We have no clue really what's going on the ground. Our government's not forthcoming. Neither are the Russians. None of these other states are. Many of them don't even have a functioning media that's not completely censored and overseen by their governments anyway. the Saudi media, the Turkish media, the Egyptian media. Oh yeah, they're fair and free outlets. I'm sure. So you get a lot of violence, and there's going to be a hell of a lot more. And if it gets as bad as I think that most of these governments are preparing for it to get, then you're going to see, if not World War III, certainly another Vietnam, only with multiple nuclear states directly involved. Hundreds of thousands of people at least will die. It'll be one of the major wars of world history, and it'll completely decimate some of these countries. They'll stop existing. Borders will shift completely as the result of such an action. So, yeah, more happy news for the day, trust me. That's about all. Peace out.